Hi folks, and welcome to another guide. If you recall, last video we looked at main supply. I would like to take a look at the secondary supply situation, and that's called port supply. And what I've done right now is I've set up, as you can see here, two scenarios just to kind of emphasize my point within the video. Once again, this is all done for you within the game itself, so this is just an explanatory video just to help you understand what's happening in the game itself. If you recall from the last video, when you click on and toggle the supply icon or button on the top, you have these values, and these values here represent the level of supply per hex. The way this is determined is, if you recall, if we take the mechanized movement from a supply source, so this is an example of a port supply source, and move away from it, what ends up happening is it will take 2 op points to move to this first hex, another 2 op points to move to the second hex, and so forth down the line. So that means these hexes here have supply level 2, 4, 6, and 8, and the port has supply level 9 out of all of it. So taking a peek here, we can see the different supply levels. I'm going to just remove the units here so you can see, zoom in here. This is what a port supply looks like. This is the icon, and you notice that this icon over towards the left here has an exclamation mark on it. And what does that mean? Well, you're playing the game, and as you can see here, I invaded Vichy, Syria, and I've taken 2 ports here, and both of them have exclamation marks on them. I have my units down here on the bottom, and when I take away supply, I've placed these in garrison mode. Now I'm going to move my cursor over one of the ports, and what I want you to pay attention to is the bottom left of your screen here. Okay, so you notice that this port here is 0 of 80. So that means that I've used 80 supply points to be able to supply the units that are located here. But you notice I also have this secondary port here, so I'm going to have to click off that, and notice that this is of size port 2 and allows me to supply 40 points of supply, and it's also at 0 at 40. So if you recall, this is at 0 of 40, and this was at 0 of 80. This one here has a port supply of 2 here. So how did you get the 40? Well, the computer does a calculation for you. It takes the size of the port and multiplies it by 20, which is the amount of supply points you get per port. So that means a 1 size port will have 20 supply points here. So this would be 40, this would be 20 out of all of it. A 9 supply port will have 180 supply points to distribute within the map itself. So let's take a look at the different ports. We'll come back to this, and let's see what the ports that we're talking about here. Here I have Tobruk, and again, what I'd like you to do is just every once in a while when I move my cursor on the screen here, I'd like you to take a look at the values of the numbers here. So you can see here that Tobruk has 38 supply points remaining out of 80. So that means it must have used, if I do 80 minus 38, it must have used 42 supply points somewhere. Well, where has it used those particular supply points? Well, if I go down here, I can see that I have a unit here, and I click on this particular unit, and again, all these calculations you can see are done for you. This unit here uses 42 supply points. So where is this unit being supplied from? Well, it looks like it is being supplied from Tobruk. And you can see this is a mechanized unit, and it'll take me 8 operational points to get me back to Tobruk. Now, I've set this up in particular like this so that I get the exclamation marks here. When you take a look at Benghazi here, it's a size 4 port, so 4 times 20 is 80. each one of these units uses up 20 supply points. So you can see the exclamation mark here comes into play because at this point in time this port here has no more supply points remaining. This one's a size 2 port, so it provides 40 supply points. Once again, I have 2 units here, both of size 20, and infantry units are not mech units, so they use a 1-to-1 ratio with regard to strength versus supply. So both of these units will use up 20 supply points, and what will end up happening is this port here is now at 0 supply level, and hence why the exclamation appears on the map. Similar with this port, Tripoli. Tripoli here, normally if none of these units were here, would have 120 supply points, but each one of these units here takes up 20 supply points. That is 1 supply point for each one of its strength because it's infantry. So all of the supply points are used up with these particular units, and hence why the exclamation point shows up here. And as you can see here, this is a mech unit. Its ratio with strength and the amount of supply it uses is a little bit greater. It's at 42 here. So you notice different from infantry units, which are using the same supply as their strength value here. It looks like here that the value seems to be 40% bigger for the supply value. So what ends up happening is the supply use for mech units and armor units is greater than a 1-to-1 ratio as opposed to infantry units here. And you can see if this unit were to move into any one of these hexes here, it would automatically be out of supply. Why is that? Well, if you think about it, you can see this is the numbers that are on the screen that are in white. Those are the map supply levels. So this one would have a map supply level of 9, and if a truck were to travel this distance, it would only be able to cover supply in these hexes that I'm highlighting here. So it'd be 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. But when you take a look at the manual, and it's always good every once in a while to kind of glance at the manual. This table here that I have is not part of the manual. That's this bottom one. I do this for myself here with some of the explanation that I want to get across. Now, when you're looking at port supply, what ends up happening is it works in conjunction with the hex supply that you saw. So remembering those have values like 9, 8, 7, 6 or whatever. So keep that in mind. This works in conjunction with those supply hex values. If you recall from the last video too, I used that particular number along with that other formula in this portion, where I went 1 minus the effectiveness level, and I multiplied it by the base plus the headquarters plus the map supply level times 2. So you can see where it plays into effect. But what's interesting is this row here where you're out of port supply. So in other words, there are possibilities where you have more units than you can actually supply. And there's some impact to those particular units, and it looks like it doesn't receive any reinforcements whatsoever, and it looks like you can only increase your effectiveness per turn by 3% as long as your unit is in a hex that has a supply level other than 0. So 1 and above out of all that. So you have to keep that in mind. So when I'm looking at this, do I have an actual example of that? And the answer to that question is yes. So what happened is I have invaded Vichy, France. And it looks like when I take a look at my supply levels here, this one here has a supply level of 0 of 80, so I've used all my supply values. Here I've used 0 out of 40, so 80 plus 40 is 120. When I go to add all of these up, what ends up happening, and what do I mean by add them all up? Well, if you take a look at the supply value of each of them, so notice this armor unit is 42. This would be of size 30, so that's going to be 30. This is also of size 30, 30, 30, 10, 10, 10. Now, because these are in garrison mode, I'm going to show you they actually use less than 10, but I kind of keep them as 10 so that I can do a rough estimate within the game itself how much supply I'd be using here. So notice here the 330s is 90, and that's just 120, just these units here. And I had 40 and 80, which is 120. So that leaves 42 unaccounted for. Well, as you can see, what ends up happening is, and I have to go to the reports to show this, one of my units will start suffering the effect of, it's not no supply, but basic supply. In other words, what ends up happening is it will get the food it requires to be able to survive. It will only increase 3% in effectiveness per turn, but can never receive any reinforcements out of it. So that unit is at 201.14. So if I'm going to be looking for that particular unit, usually all I need to do is click on a little icon on the top here. So you can see here on the top right, again taking a look at the icon here, that's what it's going to actually look like for you. So you can see it. When I go to click on it, it should take me to the unit itself. So this unit here is only going to increase in effectiveness 3% per turn because it's getting basic supply. When I go to click on it, notice it's at level 8. So that formula where I take the HQ bonus plus the base value plus 2 times 8 to calculate its actual effectiveness percentage increase with the effectiveness modifier, that won't happen. This unit here is simply going to increase to, well, 3 higher would be 79% approximately, maybe 80 if there's a rounding up value out of all of it. Now, how can you change this? Well, unfortunately, you're going to have to capture a port, or you're going to have to move units out. In this situation, because only one unit is impacted and it's still increasing in effectiveness, in other words, I don't have 20 other units all around here that are suffering the same effect here. One of the things I could do if I don't require this unit right off the bat is something like I mentioned before. When you take a look at the units, you could reduce the amount of supply that they actually use by placing them in garrison mode. So you notice here, even though this unit here is of size 10, it is using 8 supply. So it's saving 2 supply points out of all of this. The other garrison units are the same. So when you take a look at this one, again it's at 8, but it's a size 10, and this is also 8. So these 3 units being in garrison mode are at least saving 6 supply points, which could be spread to the other units that are on the map itself. That's the basics that you deal with when you're dealing with port supply. The question becomes, how do these get the supply? Well, all you need to do is go into the Convoy button, and I'm just going to concentrate on Beirut here, and I believe this port's called Tripoli. So you can see here, this is Beirut, and just to kind of highlight it, here's Beirut right here, and it's being shipped 80 supply points here. Here's Tripoli, it's being supplied 40 points. The 80 and the 40 make the 120 that I'm talking about, that will be distributed among these units here to be able to make them effective in attacking and fighting the allies. So that's how it gets the actual supply. It comes from Germany itself, and it's delivered by merchant marines into the ports automatically. You don't have to set that up. That's all done for you. Now, when you read the manual, one of the things, and again, I want to point this out, so you can see this unit here, if this unit goes beyond this, it's going to be out of supply here. So I want to just take a closer look at this particular hex. In particular, all I really want to know is its location. So when I look at this, this is location 18510. And I want you to keep that in mind. So 18510 has supply level 1. Moving back to the rules, there's a special unit here called a headquarters, and headquarters have a couple special abilities, but for this particular video I want to concentrate on one. In particular, that HQs also increase the map supply level of a friendly hex within a 5 hex radius by +1 to a maximum of 8. Hexes not in supply will have a map value level of 1. So hexes not in supply will have a map supply level of 1. Well, let's see that in action. If I go back to this unit again, like I mentioned to you, will not be able to move forward here. It'll be out of supply on the next turn, and you'll get a warning. And again, the rationale behind it is this Tobruk here is at supply level 9. The trucks can only go to the mechanized level here, or mechanized distance here, using the road, and the final distance that it can hit, so 987654321, is this, because again, when you're looking at a mech unit, it has 9 op points, and that's from 1939 is where that number comes from. So it can't go any further than this. So I'm just going to exit out of this, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to show the same situation here, but I'm going to bring in a headquarters out of all of this. So you can see I've pre-done this so that this way we can see the example a little bit faster. Now the idea behind it is, what do headquarters do? Well, they provide bonus with regard to supply, and they increase the supply value of a hex per se. That will allow me to extend my line a little bit further and show the importance of using headquarters whenever you attack. So notice in my example here, I'm not using a headquarters, but let's go back to that hex. So the hex we were originally looking at was 18510, and that's this hex right here. If you recall from the other shot here, this used to have a supply level of 1. So what has your headquarters unit done? It's increased it by 1, and all other friendly hexes is with a radius of 5. So that comes about here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you can count it. This is counted as 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, and this is 5 here. Now have a value of 1. And what ends up happening, because that has extended this to values of 1, this unit can move a little further, and now it's at hex 18910. It has moved closer to Alexandria, and now is within striking distance while still being in supply, as opposed to being back to where the headquarters is and then covering all this distance and attacking out of supply and then coming back into the supply zone to try to recover. Remember, units that are out of supply only have a certain number of turns, and again you can see it here. This is their supply level. They really only have 3 turns, and once out of supply, this will count down to 1, 0, and as it's counting down, it starts experiencing ill effects like losses in effectiveness level, lack of movement, and also strength losses. So keep that in mind as you're going through this. Being in supply is very important, and here you can see an example where a headquarters has taken it looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hexes. So these are the hexes here. These 8 hexes were within that 5 radius range and extended it. Now remember, this is circular, so these units here are also extended and increased by 1 also out of all of it. So keep that in mind as you're going through it. But it has allowed me to move forward 4 more units, which is extremely helpful in dealing with an attack itself. So you can see, if I try to summarize here very quickly, And again, I can summarize from this particular one. Supply still comes from your home country. And what ends up happening with port supply, and again, just to kind of really draw this out here, what ends up happening, and I might get Berlin wrong here, but I think it's about here, or it's here, one of the two, but here you go. It will come down and it'll come to one of the ports that are here. And then what ends up happening is the supply will be delivered to the different ports. Now these are Italian ports here, so Germany would actually not deliver to them, but it gives you a kind of idea here. From the ports itself, what will end up happening, and it may not be this port, it might be from Greece or whatever, but it's automatically done for you that these ports will be supplied based off of the size of the port itself. So when you take a look at it, remember again, a port of size 1 has 20 supply points. A port of size 9, if you multiply that by 20, will have 180 supply points out of all of it. What else? Well, if you take a look at one of the things I have not mentioned yet and kind of summarized, if I look at the unit here, it's actually saying that it's using 42 supply points. This is a size 10 unit, so it's using 10 supply points. So if I take a look at this from a point of view of numbers, here I've got 10, 42, and that should be 52 points that I'm using for supply. So keep that in mind, 52 points for supply. But when I go to Tobruk here, so here's Tobruk, I only have 15 points left. So I'm using more than 52 points. And the question then becomes, why am I using more than 52 points here? In fact, when I take a look at this, I'm using 65 points here to be able to supply this. Well, it turns out that the distance from the port has an effect on how many supply points it's going to cost. So when you go back to the manual here, what ends up happening is if the distance within the port is between 0 and 10, then the supply level would be 1 to 1. So that is, you'll get 1 supply point per every strength that you need. And remember, all those values, so the 1-to-1 ratio is always on the board. So on the counter itself, when you see the supply level it's using the 1-to-1 ratio. But if you extend your distance between 11 and 20, the ratio becomes 4 to 3. That is, 4 supply points are required to supply 3 strength points. And if you go from 21 to 30, then it's a 2-to-1 ratio where you're going to need 2 supply points for every 1 strength point. And anything above 31 here, 31 and above, you can't receive supply from the port itself. So if we're going to look at this a different way, one way of looking at it is, well, if you have a port, let's say, and I'm going to pick the second one here, port size of 2, it can produce, or it will receive, I should say, or be able to distribute or handle 40 supply points. Well, if your unit is at a distance between 1 and 10 from the port, all 40 of those points can be distributed and used at a 1-to-1 ratio. But if it is between 11 and 20, really only 30 points are going to be available. It's going to lose 10 points basically with the travel, and that's the 4 to 3 ratio that you're dealing with. And if you're between 21 and 30, what ends up happening is half of those points will be lost in the distance traveled to get to that unit. And again, that deals with the distance traveling and being able to cover that distance. It will be a 2-to-1 ratio, anything beyond a distance of 21 and 30. So if that's the case, that would mean that when I take a look at my example again, so I'm going to go back to my example, I can see right off the bat, sorry about that, I jumped all over the place here. When I look at this unit here, I'm definitely greater than a distance of 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So this is not really using 42 supply points here. In fact, if I were to take a look at this, this is actually using, and if I use the 4:3 ratio here, this is using approximately either 55 or 56 supply points. So when you're looking at this, this is using 10 because it's within that 1 to 10 ratio here. This ratio here is between the 11 and 20 ratio. So that would mean, distance. So this would be at a 4:3 ratio. This would be at a 1:1 ratio. So this uses up 10 supply points, and this one here will end up using not 42, but 55 supply points out of all of it. That is, if you look at a 4:3 ratio here, that means for every supply point before, it's using about 1/3 more. So you're really looking at here from the point of view of 42 divided by 3 here is going to be the extra supply points it's going to use on top of the 42. So if I work that out, that's going to be 14, and 14 here plus 42 turns out to be the 56 here. So it's approximately 55 or 56 points that it's going to be using. Again, I don't know how the program deals with decimals, whether it truncates them or rounds up. I have no idea, but the idea is there that we're dealing with, instead of using 42 points, because the ratio has changed, this will actually use approximately 55 or 56 supply points out of all of it. But the good part of it is, even though you are using a little bit more supply, the headquarters unit has provided you with this extra buffer distance to allow you to concentrate more on an attack. So you can bring more units up here, and again, it'll be affected by supply. I wouldn't be keeping these units here, so these ports here won't be 0. Well, they could be 0 because these units might be over here, but at least from my point of view, these ports here will also be supplying these units further down. Remember too, to be able to receive the supply, your hex has to have a supply value. So if I were to take this unit here and bring it out to, let's say, this unit or this hex here, what would end up happening is, no matter what, this part of the map here will not be able to get any supply, because again, my trucks have to travel, and the furthest they can travel is the distances you see here. The ones mark the boundary level out of all of it. Now the reason why these ones here aren't 1 is because the terrain here must be, it's such that it would require 2 op points to be able to move, which is a desert, and hence why I can't move into that particular hex. So that's port supply in a nutshell. Very straightforward and simple. Now from the opponent's point of view, what can you do to mess up, let's say, a person, your opponent, with regard to supply? Well, here, when you look at this example here, I'm on the brink of so close to being short of supply. And I don't mean it from a point of view where it's going to be detrimental to the health of my units. It's just that they're not going to be able to increase their effectiveness as quickly as I would like. Well, one thing you could do as an opponent is you can use aircraft to actually interdict the supply of a port. So to do that, what you need is, you need operational points remaining. You have to set yourself to full support mode and naval bombardment. Another thing that you can do is, and again, I usually go into raider mode to make it a little bit more difficult and take the bonus. Another thing that you could do is be about 2 or 3 hexes away from a port itself. I think the maximum is 5, with 1 operational point here left. So now I can use this fleet to interdict to Bruck here. I'm going to use a battleship here, and again I'm going to go into raider mode, and I'm going to go here, and then I'm going to use this other ship here, and again in raider mode to affect the other port here. Now these ships here each have an operational point remaining. They're in raider mode, and they've been assigned, well, I can't say for the airplane assigned to Tripoli. It will automatically pick its own out of all of it. So let's move forward here and see here what message we get as we from the German perspective with what my opponent has done by trying to block some of my supply. Well, now you can see it. What ends up happening is you could destroy some of the merchant marines that are, and it's really not destroying it, you're really destroying the supply points. There is a certain percentage where you can destroy a merchant marine, and offhand I don't know what those numbers are, but you can see in the report here that there's been some attacks on the convoys that are supplying my port, and now all of a sudden you notice there's a lot of units that are getting basic port supply. So that means, again, they can only increase in effectiveness by 3% if they're on a hex with a supply level on it. Remember that it has to have that. You can't be off supply like this hex over here. And it looks like that the Air Force destroyed 40 stockpile supplies, and it looks like I lost 40 and 60 in other locations in these. So where do I find stuff like that? Well, again, the game is well designed in a sense to be able to see what's happening very quickly, neatly. If you take a look at your top right of your screen here, you can see those exclamation marks here. Those are the interdictions that I'm talking about. These icons here are the basic port supply. So in other words, the units there are going to just receive them. So if I want to see which units, I'm going to zoom in a bit so we can get a little bit closer here. So zooming in here, we can see that this unit here, or sorry, this port here took a hit, and you can go and see it on the reports too and see which that it was actually the air unit that actually did that. This is another way of going about doing it. You can see Tobruk took a hit from this fleet over here, and this Beirut took a hit here, and this one here didn't have an impact out of all of it. So in the long run now, and again you can click on these and it'll repeat exactly what I did with the combat report. Again, you can see all my ports are of 0, but now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of these, whereas before I only had 1 of these showing up. So again, clicking on these, I can see that my headquarters is getting basic supply, my mech unit is getting basic supply, my unit in Beirut is getting basic supply, but my other units here, I'm getting more units that have basic supply in here, whereas it was only 1, I believe, which was the one in Beirut before. So you can see how your opponent could affect the amount of supply that enters your port by either using their aircraft or their fleets to interdict it and destroy some of the supplies that are moving from Germany through a port to the ports like Beirut or Tobruk. That's an option that your opponent has. But if you notice, and this is a special note too, even though these units are getting basic supply, they are not out of supply. So when you take a look at their supply level here, their supply level remains 3. So the only impact that they will have is, instead of the big formula for calculating the effectiveness, this unit here will only be able to increase 3% in its effectiveness ratio, and this unit also will only be able to increase 3%, plus all the other units that are in port supply. So keep that in mind. It's not so much of a panic situation. It's just that you're not getting the full effect of repair of your effectiveness, and you're only getting basic supplies to be able to attack and to be able to survive without penalties other than not being able to increase your effectiveness, as let's say this armor unit which is not in basic supply, or this infantry unit which is not in basic supply. These units would get the formula that I explained in the first video and the benefit of the hex itself. So this armor unit, it's 9 times 2 plus 6, would be the addition, and that would be 1 minus whatever its original effectiveness level was, up to a maximum of 100%. So keep that in mind. Notice you can, with a supply truck, and that's something else I haven't mentioned yet, if you take a look at a supply truck, what ends up happening is it will increase your effectiveness level to 106, and it also increases your supply amount by 1. So that's the added bonus of using a supply truck with a unit in conjunction with the map supply level and its effectiveness recovery. Well, hopefully this video has explained to you why you see those exclamation marks on the map itself, what the numbers here on the map, the white numbers here, mean in conjunction, how they impact your units with regard to effectiveness, and the use of headquarters in terms of stretching out the hex supply a radius of 5 units, so that in this situation, as you can see, I can get my units a little bit closer to being able to capture an objective. Headquarters have other bonuses, and again, one of the ways that you can see which units are attached to your headquarters is when you go to click on it, you'll see this kind of orange little kind of tag or flag that appears beside the unit that is attached to that particular headquarters. So hopefully this video has helped. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. And again, this is all done for you, so it's not a panic situation. This video is more of an explanation of how the game's mechanics work. This is all under the hood. You don't have to worry about the calculations. It's just a matter of understanding what's happening. Like, for example, that this particular unit is using 55 supply points. Well, all you really need to know is that it's using more supply points than 42, because the distance between it and the port that's supplying it is greater than 10 hexes. So keep that in mind. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you again very much for watching, and stay safe. Take care for now. Bye now.